Today I want to turn to one of the most famous concepts that is associated with Heidegger's being and time, and that's the concept of the so-called ontic ontological difference, called auf Deutsch die ontisch-ontologische Differenz. And we will see that it hides a great deal of what we have already discussed in the last sessions. The concept ontic refers, very generally speaking, to the meaning of how an entity shows or presents itself to us in our everyday world or in our everyday life. The word ontic is derived from the present participle of the Greek word eimi, which can be translated as to be or to present or to exist. So when Heidegger mentions the word ontic in his concept, the ontic ontological difference, he refers to the phenomenal level of how things appear to us or present themselves to us in everyday life, as I just said, without our capacity somehow kicking in to also reflect theoretically about them. In contrast, the concept ontological refers to the actual theoretical investigation of the phenomenal experience of how things and entities present themselves to us. But, and this is important, does not necessarily mean that we human beings have to be ontologists 24 hours every day to live up to the demand of what Heidegger strives to conceptualize with this concept, the ontic ontological difference. It is rather that we human beings cannot get rid of this difference, since our own existence is lacking meaning to us, or is always lacking some kind of metaphysical meaning, in such a way that our own existence becomes also problematic, but not only our existence, but our existence among all the entities surrounding us. That can be other human beings or trivial things or animals or whatever. Now Heidegger writes that Dasein is somehow trapped in between this difference. So the trivial appearance of how reality affects us in our everyday life naively, and nevertheless our capacity to reflect on our own ontological status in which we are surrounded by other entities and their ontological status. So I repeat, so Heidegger writes that Dasein is somehow trapped in between this difference, the ontic and ontological difference, the difference of somehow taking in the world as we breathe in the air on a naive level of everyday experience, and the capacity of thinking about what it is that we take for granted in, or what it is that we somehow breathe in like the air. This is why he writes, it is peculiar to this entity, and the entity is Dasein, so our very special way of, as human beings, to exist, that with and through its being, this being is disclosed to it. Understanding of being is itself a definite characteristic of the Dasein's being. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological, and I give you another quote, which expresses some of the same argument or the same thought. Here, being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. So you don't have to be an ontologist to nevertheless live up to the ontic ontological difference. Another quote. So if we should reserve the term ontology for that theoretical inquiry, which is explicitly devoted to the meaning of entities, then what we have had in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. It does not signify simply being ontological, however, but rather being in such a way that one has an understanding of being. Okay, this sounds abstract. I think what the argument is, I will try to explain this in the following word. When Heidegger says that existence is ontological, i.e. that it is somehow inherent to Dasein to be focused on whatever kind of basic structures reality is, or the structures we live in, then he does not mean that we human beings must permanently pursue ontology as the science of being, or as the science of the basic structures of being in order to be human agents in the world. This would be obviously absurd. Because explicitly he says, and this is quoted, being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. And obviously, because we cannot claim that people on the street all read Plato or Aristotle or Heidegger and as such participate in academic debates about concepts like existence, being, thinking, and so. And from here find their true meaning, that would be absurd. But nevertheless, also the non-academic persons somehow are entrapped in this ontological difference because they see there is meaning lacking in their life world time and again, and they see there's a difference between their form of existence and the form of existence of tares, jables, animals, etc. So Heidegger wants to underline that Dasein, as I said, the very special existence which is peculiar to mankind, is always at least intended to penetrate its own form of existence, somehow to be philosophically inclined, one could say. And this is obviously something that we don't see in the animal kingdom. Therefore, Heidegger says, following quote, "What we have had in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. To put it in other words, if there is talk of existence being ontological that is also supposed to be pre-ontological, then this is so because in our own way, being has always been part of our nature, which sometimes wants to look behind the appearances out there or wants to look behind the veil of Maya. We want to know what reality is metaphysically all about. And as I said, this affects obviously the metaphysician, but not only the academic field. It is something that is inscribed to Dasein's preconditions of what Dasein is about. It is entrapped in this ontological difference. The being confronted naively with the world and nevertheless having a desire to know what it is all about that the world he or she is surrounded by has in common or has a deeper meaning of. As I said, this does not mean that we have to practice ontology as a science or that we have to become philosophers, and yet we still want to somehow penetrate the veils of the world of appearances. We want to look behind the scenes of our lives and we want to know what it is about. And in this sense, we are always somehow haunted by this ontological difference. This difference marks the fact that we live in appearances as that which is real to us, but as I said, we strive for truth as well as something that reality hides from us. This is why you could say that people, for example, belong to a religion, or they go to church, or they go into a museum, or they strive for transcendent experiences. In that sense, all these practices show that we human beings somehow venerate a dimension of reality. You may call it an other dimension, a third dimension in the here and now, that cannot be obviously exclusively explained in scientific terms or by the natural sciences, at least for many people. So again, to underline this argument, Dasein is affected by a gap of how things appear and by what is missing within the appearances of things, but also within within Dasein's own relations, within Dasein's own relation to the things out there. So Dasein is affected by a gap of how things appear and by what is missing within appearances. The world presents itself to us on an ontic level of everyday life within multiple horizons of meaning, but it also evokes our desire to infiltrate deeper meanings which remain hidden behind superficial appearances, at least so sometimes it appears to us. But nevertheless, obviously there are hidden meanings surrounding us because there are always multiple layers of specializations, horizons of meaning, contexts, overlapping layers of meaning contexts that have an impact on us, and I think nobody of us can say that we all dominate these contexts we live in. And that's why we practice, among other things, philosophy, or we practice religion, or we practice art of the natural sciences, because we want to understand the truth behind the screen of our daily lives, since we are confronted time and again with a lack of meaning, insight, interchanging, and even contradicting horizons of meaning and horizons of truth. Obviously, creatures in the animal kingdom are cut off from this ontological difference, and as such are cut off from the quest for a deeper meaning of being. I mean, what would this be for an animal? To ask, I don't know what it means to be a tree, or what a tree is, what's the essence of a tree. We never see animals confronted with these kinds of questions. Obviously, there are also times in our own lives when we don't want to know anything about these kind of questions as well. For example, we might be overwhelmed with stress or burdened by anxiety, and any talk of being appears trivial and childish. But this is not what it is about for Heidegger, because for him we have not only to focus on the scientific questions of what exists, but also scrutinize that there is something that exists for us. One can trivialize this argument in the following way. At some point, every human being, I think, will be impressed, for example, by a sunset, or by a work of art in a museum, or by a scientific discovery or a poem. And then we could say, here we have experiences, especially maybe aesthetic experiences, where the subject, he or she, is reflected back on him or herself in such an experience, as somehow transformed in the ontological status in which she now has, or he now has, an aesthetic experience. So the fundamental structure of reality appears to change. Or in other words, reality shows another dimension of what there is. And I think we cannot deny these experiences in which we are somehow torn out of everyday life, or where we are somehow reflected back on our own status in the world and somehow question or relate in a new way to our outside world. Again and again, we have experience of this third dimension that shows us that the carpet or the texture of our everyday life we walk on is not all there is, obviously. Otherwise, we would not have these borderline experiences. And I think even the most radical eliminative naturalist would probably not deny these experiences. When Heidegger explains the method of phenomenology in paragraph 8 of Being and Time, and then derives the Greek word phenomenon etymologically as that which refers us to how an entity shows or manifests itself as an entity to us, he does so to underline that it is not exclusively us, also us people, that manifest reality in a space of shared reasons, but the world somehow, also mystically speaking, manifests itself to us as something autonomous, or being manifests itself as something autonomous, because we are always in these mystical relations to being, where being shows or presents something that transcends our everyday conceptual reality. We orient ourselves in clusters of all kinds of meaning, but time and again reality withdraws or hides insight, and sometimes it presents new insights to us. Heidegger distances himself here indirectly from the concept of appearances as this concept is used by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason. For Kant, phenomena are objects of empirical observation. They can be clearly defined in form of a proposition, for example. For Heidegger, phenomena cannot be reduced to epistemological conditions of their perception, or are not the stuff our experiences are made of in an analytic interpretation. We do not comprehend what a phenomenon in the Heideggerian sense is by recognizing the objectivity of what Kant calls appearances as the stuff our experiences are made of. It's rather for Heidegger the other way around. We comprehend Kant's talk of appearances, or what appearances are, as the material our experiences are made of, because we always already know what phenomena in the Heideggerian sense are on an ontic level. Phenomena in the sense of phenomenology are not states of affairs in the world we express within the predicative form of a judgment, but phenomena have always shaped our perception before our thinking reflects about the relation of mind and world. And I think here again you see somehow the radical shift that Heidegger's phenomenology strives for in comparison to the philosophical tradition. He wants not only to focus on what an entity is, but he wants to focus on the consequences that an entity is, or that reality is. Suddenly, something reveals itself to us, and for Heidegger, such experiences somehow define existence, at least for the human being. As I said, we do not permanently pursue ontology or think ontologically about our reality, and yet we experience ourselves again and again in transcendent references where we are strangely affected, sized, and reflected back on ourselves and our position in reality, in the structure and the social fabric of our reality. And in that sense, or so I understand Heidegger's complicated talk of Dasein being bound up in an ontological difference. We have always already understood unthematically what we encounter in an inner-worldly way. But this does not preclude that the horizon of our understanding remains hidden or diffuse to us. And this is one reason why Heidegger writes the following words. That which is ontically closest and well known to Dasein is ontologically the farthest and not known at all. End of quote. So what is close to us is also the most ontologically distant, because we move naturally in our socio-economic life world or texture without knowing on what social and historical assumptions we have built our world, or on which assumptions we have received passively the world we are thrown into. In that sense, he says, well, also ontically we are very close, obvious, to what is trivially out there. I mean, for example, the auditorium is out there, I have no questions. But nevertheless, when I focus ontologically, then I see that what is ontically the closest to my relation is somehow ontologically the most farthest away, because I have never questioned all these relations that surround me, but nevertheless that shape my own Dasein in these horizons of meaning. Heidegger's book, Being in Time, wants to expose Dasein in its relation to what it is ontologically dependent on, but this is only possible within an ontological analysis of the world as it presents itself to us naively, ontically. And he criticizes, as we have heard, that a large part of the philosophical tradition has never considered exactly this question of investigation, the way in which reality precedes phenomenologically our thinking, our recognizing, and our rationalizing. Heidegger claims that the ontological priority of Dasein, as he describes it, was observed early on. So he didn't invent it. But the philosophical tradition understood man as one being among the many being in one world, somehow in space and time. And his remarks on Aristotle and Thomas at the end of paragraph 4 refer to this dilemma. There he writes, Aristotle determined the human way of understanding what exists, thus the object world, with regard to the fact that it is, and with regard to its being as it is, end of quote. And Thomas Aquinas redefines the human soul as a being, a thing-like object, and the task, or the soul's task as a thing-like object, is to find, through understanding, its accordance with other existing things of the objective world. So Heidegger's problem with this interpretation of the human condition is obvious, because he says, well, the classical philosophical metaphysical tradition has always put the human being as an entity among other entities, but it has never focused on the special ontological status of Dasein. Heidegger's problem with this interpretation of the human condition is raised at the end of paragraph 6 of Being in Time. He accuses the philosophers just mentioned, so Aristotle and Thomas, and the philosophical tradition of the tendency to interpret existence and being always with regard to an object's existence inscribed into time and space. So as a worldly entity, we can objectify and define. Bearing in mind the risk that I might sink in your esteem, I would nevertheless like to refer to two photos from the Matrix movie, which for me express this relationship of Dasein and being symbolically quite well. I think the pictures put, allegorically speaking, Heidegger's bold claim into an image that the objective world with its multiple states of affairs is penetrated with us due to invisible but nonetheless anthematic moments of knowledge that have always pre-structured reality and whose dimensions of meaning are permanently hiding, showing themselves, withdrawing or overlapping. As you probably all know, the film Matrix tells the story that the supposedly objective reality is only the result of algorithms computers generate. They are transformed into electrical signals, which are directly then connected to the neuronal systems of our brains. A cosmos of science generated by computers is thus the true algorithm behind our perception. The algorithms are the meta-reality behind the reality of phenomena, one could say. But obviously, Heidegger's philosophy does not want to propagate that there truly exists a meta-reality behind an ontic reality, but he nevertheless perceives the world as being caught up in this kind of split realities that the Matrix movie is built upon, and Dasein is always somehow affected by this reality, or a split reality between authenticity and false reality and appearances, the reality of reality and the falsity of appearances. So reality, one could say, is split by phenomena which hide each other, with the effect that we human beings cannot bring order into the relationship of mind and world, though this is something we somehow strive for. There is obviously no true reality behind reality, but nevertheless we are thrown into a swirling cosmos of multiple meanings which pushes appearances into our mental states and suppress other appearances, so that we are always looking for an order within these different layers of meaning and these different concepts of truth to which we have to relate. In other words, when we put ourselves as an object alongside other objects in space and time, then we, according to Heidegger, do not see the influence we have to change reality in the way that, for example, the hero Neo in the Matrix movie can allegedly change his reality by somehow having effect on the world of appearances and perceiving the matrix or perceiving the different layers of reality, as for example in this very famous scene. In this famous scene at the end of the movie, the hero exactly does this. He now has, allegedly, the superpower to see, again, metaphorically speaking, the ontic ontological split, something we human beings will never be able to, obviously. He sees appearances and at the same time what all these appearances are made of, in this case, algorithms or concepts alien machines feed our brain with to suck then the energy of our bodies like out of a Duracell battery. For Heidegger, nevertheless, Dasein has somehow a similar potential, not only to perceive appearances or to get lost in appearances, but to transgress and even have an effect on them, changing the basic structures of reality. Dasein can, in a way, change the basic structures of reality when it liberates itself from the tradition or from certain traditions of philosophy or thinking tools which reduce being to a trivial concept of the copula within a subject-object judgment. And in that sense, this is what he criticizes the metaphysical tradition of, exactly having done this, reducing being not to an existential, reducing being to a predicate structure and having missed the existential dimension of being as it is inscribed into Dasein. Gerd Heffner, a philosopher here at the Munich School of Philosophy who taught for years Heidegger, describes this well in one of his books, because there he writes, "As I reach out into the world, so the world meets me." This might sound a little bit like a New Age spirituality, I admit, in the sense of liberate yourself and your consciousness can change the world. And to understand Heidegger in such a reductionist way does obviously not do him justice. But several authors have pointed out the extent to which Heidegger's Being and Time reintegrates, knowingly or unknowingly, that cannot decide, so-called Eastern philosophical traditions via the detour of his criticism of Occidental philosophy. Indirectly, he does indeed assume a certain spiritualism that is the opposite of certain Occidental rationalistic schools of thought. Again, speaking very generally here. And as I said, there is a mystical, spiritual dimension to Heidegger's work. For example, when he speaks of language as the house of being, das Haus des Seins, or emphasizes how being shows itself to us in unprecedented experiences through unprecedented events in his so-called Ereignisphilosophie. Dasein can focus on the way its existence is shaped by the tradition it grew up in, and that therefore always precedes it. Yet at the same time, and this is why the ontological difference comes back to Dasein or haunts Dasein, because at the same time Dasein must co-determine what the world and reality means to it existentially. And in that sense, being is not a question of a copula and a predicate judgment. This is part of what Dasein can do, what it is called upon to do, and what it is part of its destiny, to know how Dasein relates to itself and to its virtual self-images, at least in Being and Time. Only in the so-called later Heidegger, the Heidegger of the Kehre, we have somehow a Heidegger who questions his early existential interpretation of Dasein. One could say, well, what is Dasein related to with regards to existential crises or its existential dimension of existence? Well, it could be confronted with questions like, also we are familiar with from the Matrix movie, do I deliberately lose myself in a life that is similar to a life living in the Matrix? That means blinded by others who profit from me? Do I want a life in an authenticity, perhaps the life of a philosopher? But maybe this life is also a ready-made life too, not as authentic as I might think. Heidegger does not give us here a clear answer what Dasein is supposed to do. Of course, why should he? Obviously he cannot, because it remains a singular individual question. But he just tells us with his interpretation that obviously Dasein is always confronted time and again with this ontological tension. Heidegger's talk of an ontological difference is therefore an outspoken critique of classical metaphysics, which has devoted itself primarily to the question of what things are, but has not investigated that they are. In this sense, the mistake of metaphysics lies in the fact that it subordinates existence to a being that is embodied in some kind of highest entity, God, sense, goal, arche, the beginning of all, while Heidegger's concept of an ontological difference inscribed into Dasein wants to de-essentialize existence, wants to de-essentialize the human condition, and does not want to put it in a relation with a metaphysical entity of being, God, sense, beginning, the goal of all. It wants to free subjectivity from enslavement to being as a fixed set of states of affairs. Before every what for or why, things are simple. They just happen in an archaic way. Ontological difference does not mean a meta difference between phenomena on the one side and something more fundamental, God, being or substance on the other. The ontological difference is that which makes a totalization of being in its entirety impossible. And Dasein incorporates this insight. The difference between what exists and its being is at the same time a difference within the existence of things themselves, i.e., the difference between entities and the horizon of meaning always splits the field of being itself and makes it incomplete. I want to end this talk with some comments on Heidegger's remarks on time, since being is, according to Heidegger, obviously related to time. I mean, that's what being and time is all about. Generally speaking, one can say Heidegger's insight is also very trivial. Being is not a container within time, but being is time itself. What does this actually mean? Well, Heidegger argues first that he makes a distinction between his concept of time and a vulgar concept of time. And vulgar does not mean here a disqualifying way of time, but in the way of customary. In the context of our everyday experience of life, time is seen as a sequence of moments. For example, I get up in the morning, then I have my breakfast, at the end I go to sleep, and whatever. And Heidegger claims that it was Aristotle who in his book Physics gave us the philosophical and foundation of this ordinary understanding of time. And he claims that this understanding of time then determines somehow the history of ontology, at least from Plato on, or from Aristotle on. Heidegger's arguments on time go back to lectures on the phenomenology of religion, which he gave in the years 1920 and 1921. And in these lectures, he presents time as that which relates as human being to the end of time, the parousia of the Messiah, the return of the Messiah. Since this return, so the return of the Messiah, can happen anytime, life, and this is what is so important for Heidegger, is always on the edge of an existential crisis because Christ can return anytime. We have to be prepared for Christ's return, and we cannot count on time as a sequence of predictable moments from now until retirement. Heidegger writes, "Time must be brought to light and generally conceived as the horizon of all understanding of being and for any way of interpreting it. In order for us to discern this, time needs to be explicated primordially as the horizon of the understanding of being and in terms of temporality as the being of Dasein which understands being. In its dependence on time, Dasein interests Heidegger primarily because it literally eludes the effort to substantialize human identity. Time is not, as in Kant, one of two a priori forms of intuition which guarantee experiences. So again, we see here time in an existential interpretation and not in an epistemological interpretation. Man as Dasein does not stand in time like a container in absolute space as assumed by Isaac Newton. Time is being, and so existence becomes ephemerality, rather. Temporality cannot be confronted, but precedes Dasein. From here on, we can see how the category of time helps Heidegger to reopen or to open up a whole series of subcategories in his existential analysis of Dasein, because in subsequent chapters of Being and Time, he refers to categories like worry, anxiety, being towards death, as existential and not theoretical categories which help us understand Dasein. Traditionally, though, categories have been interpreted as highest genera of entities, and this is why Heidegger doesn't play the game of categories, but plays the game of existentials. Aristotle presents us a very famous, or the most famous list of categories in his book called Categories. Categories help us to define entities of experience with regard to their substance, for example. That's one category, to their quantity, another category, their location in time, their location in space, etc. And the second most important list of categories in the history of philosophy is presented by Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason. Here in Kant's work, categories are derived from forms of possible judgment. Objective empirical judgments confer meaning thanks to a priori concepts which judgments cannot do without. Now, Heidegger's list of categories as existentials has nothing to do, obviously, with these lists of his predecessors. He is not interested in a priori conditions of entities to be the source of our experience. He is interested only in categories he calls existentials. They analyze Dasein's ontic relation to horizons of meaning in which entities qua being in space and time play no important role, because this is what the traditional philosophy has already focused upon, and in that sense has always missed the existential dimension of existentials, which somehow pre-structure then our categories. So again, we see what a phenomenological approach to the mind-world relationship is about. It does not start with a subject and ends with the relation to an object. It starts with experiences which transform subjectivity to a secondary effect of practices in which truth and meaning have a narrow role to play, because truth and meaning have nothing now to do with the analysis of truth values and propositions. Truth and meaning have something to do with different layers of experiences where Dasein is confronted time and again with a third dimension of reality that cannot be defined by the natural sciences, but only somehow by phenomenology as an existential philosophy. Thanks for your attention.